Hi guys, welcome back to another video. Aston Martin was founded in 1913 by Lionel Martin and Robert Bamford as Bamford and Martin. They made their first car in 1915, but due to World War I it couldn't go into production. Bamford left the company in 1920 and Lionel began producing racing cars in 1922 with funding from an English count who would later become the inspiration for Ian Fleming's Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. Lionel's racing cars would set world speed and endurance records, but sadly they went bankrupt in 1924. They were bought, but in 1925 Martin was forced to sell the company. The company was taken over and renamed Aston Martin Motors. Race cars continued to be the focus until financial troubles meant that in 1936 the focus shifted to road cars. 700 were made before the outbreak of World War II, and production shifted to aircraft components. In 1947 the story becomes more familiar. David Brown buys the company and begins work on the DB series of cars. In 1950 Aston Martin announced their Le Mans racer, the DB2. The first car that we'll be driving up the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb is the 1956 DBR1. This car was the result of regulation changes stating that entrance no longer had to be road legal. It was powered by a 2.9 litre straight-six engine which produced around 250 brake horsepower. The DBR1 would see Aston Martin's first outright Le Mans victory in 1959 with Carroll Shelby and Roy Salvadori at the wheel. Their car, which I'll be driving, sold for $22,555,000 in 2017, a record for a British car. Now let's see how quickly it can go up the Festival of Speed hill climb. And the Aston Martin DBR1 did the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb in 58.6 seconds. Now that's 2.3 seconds quicker than the 250 GTO went up the hill, which is the closest car to the 250 GT long wheelbase that the DBR1 beat in 1959 at Le Mans. Now, as with all of these multi-car hill climb videos, I'm not going to show you the leaderboards until the very end. So let's move on to our next car, the Aston Martin DB5. Now the DB5 was released in 1963 and became famous the world over for its starring appearance in 1964's James Bond film, Goldfinger. The DB5 had a 4 litre straight-six producing up to 325 brake horsepower and a top speed of 145 miles per hour. A DB5 with a 5-speed gearbox originally sold for £4,250, that's £85,500 in today's money. Now they are selling for upwards of £500,000, and with the Goldfinger DB5 selling for $6.4 million this summer. So let's see how quickly this Grand Tourer can get up the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb. And the Aston Martin DB5 did the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb in 1 minute, 1 second, 0.2. Now, that's obviously quite slow, but if we compare it to the BMW 507 road car, which is a bit older, that did it in 1 minute, 2 seconds. So it's not far off the pace. Now, we're going to jump quite a long way ahead to get to our next car, the 2005 Aston Martin DBR9. Now, between 1964 and 2005, Aston Martin had gone bankrupt and changed hands a few more times. In 1991, Aston Martin was put under control of the Ford Motor Company. They immediately began designing and constructing the DB7. The DB7 was produced between 1994 and 2004 with 7,000 cars hitting the road. In 2003, the DB9 was announced to replace the DB7, and alongside it, Aston Martin announced its return to racing in 2005 with a partnership with ProDrive. Now, their first car together would be the DBR9, named after the DBR1 race car, which we drove up the hill first. Now, this car boasted a 6-litre V12 producing 625 brake horsepower, and it famously won its LMGT1 class in 2007 and 2008 at the Le Mans 24 Hours. Now, let's see how quickly this gorgeous race car can go up the hill. And the Aston Martin DBR9 did the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb in 47.2 seconds. Now, that makes it just a little bit quicker than the Ferrari LaFerrari and Porsche 918 Spider. Now, in the James Bond film Die Another Day, Pierce Brosnan drove a Vanquish, nicknamed the Vanish. In 2007, Aston Martin began selling the DBS to replace the outgoing Vanquish. It was first seen in the 2006 James Bond film Casino Royale, in which Ben Collins, the former Stig, broke the record for the most cannon rolls in a car with an incredible 7 rolls. Now, the DBS had a 5.9-litre V12 which produced 510 brake horsepower and had a top speed of 191 miles per hour. Now, I absolutely love the DBS. I think it is one of the most gorgeous Aston Martins to date. So let's see how quickly it can go up the hill climb. The Aston Martin DBS did the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb in 53.3 seconds. Now, we currently haven't driven any similar cars up the hill, so we can't compare that time to anything in its class. However, the current closest car is the Chevrolet NASCAR, which we drove up a few episodes ago, and that did the hill climb in 54 seconds. In 2008, Aston Martin Racing, the racing team set up by ProDrive and Aston Martin, decided they wanted to enter the Le Mans prototype category as well as the GT categories. To do this, they installed the engine from a DBR9 into a Lola prototype chassis, and the Lola Aston Martin B09/60 was born. This car made its debut in the 2009 Le Mans series to mark the 50th anniversary of Aston Martin's first Le Mans victory with the DBR1. The Lola Aston Martin would go on to win the championship that year and finish 4th at Le Mans after the factory cars of Peugeot and Audi, who were running their diesel-powered cars. Now let's see how quickly this Golf liveried car can make it up the hill. The Lola Aston Martin B09/60 did the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb in 46.1 seconds. Now that puts it 0.1 seconds behind the Sauber C9 and McLaren P1, and I think that's just another testament to how good the P1 actually is. The next car we're going to drive up the hill is the £1 million supercar, the Aston Martin 177. This car was limited to 77 units at £1 million each, however one was sadly written off in Hong Kong, so now there are only 76 remaining. It was fitted with a 7.3 litre V12 producing 750 brake horsepower. It did 0 to 60 miles per hour in 3.7 seconds and had a top speed of 220 miles per hour. This truly was a supercar and one of the most desirable Aston Martins ever produced. Now let's see how quickly it can go up Lord March's drive. The Aston Martin 177 did the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb in 50.8 seconds. Now that makes it quicker than the Shelby Daytona and 2.5 seconds quicker than the Aston Martin DBS. We haven't driven any supercars of a similar era to make comparison, but I'll definitely be doing that in the future. In 2012, Aston Martin made a return to GT racing after only running in the prototype class in 2011. Their new car was to be based on the V8 Vantage and would be entered into both the GTE Pro and GTE AM classes of the Le Mans 24 Hours. Previously, these cars have been run as customer cars since 2008, but with a full works team operating them, Aston Martin were officially back in GT racing. For the 2013 season, Aston Martin would compete in the full World Endurance Championship, with Bruno Senna taking the wheel of one of their GTE Pro cars. These GTE cars had a 4.5 litre V8 producing around 450 brake horsepower. Now these are the Aston Martin racing cars that I remember watching at Le Mans and on television, so let's see how quickly one can go up the hill. Aston Martin Vantage GTE did the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb in 48.6 seconds. That puts it ahead of the 177 by 2.2 seconds and 0.3 seconds behind the Lamborghini Huracan Performante. After running the Vantage GTE for 5 seasons and it becoming outdated in comparison to the competition, Aston Martin decided it needed an overhaul. In 2018, Aston Martin Racing unveiled the Vantage GTE, also known as the Vantage AMR. It was based on the new Vantage road car and boasted an AMG-derived 4-litre turbocharged V8, which pumped out around 500 brake horsepower. I think this car looks absolutely stunning, and having seen it in person at Goodwood, it certainly has a menacing presence to it. Let's see how quickly it can go up the Festival of Speed hill climb. The 2018 Aston Martin Vantage GTE did the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb in 48.1 seconds. Now that puts it 0.2 seconds quicker than the Lamborghini Huracan Performante and 0.2 seconds behind the Ferrari 312T and the McLaren M8C. Now let's take a look at the leaderboard for all the cars we've driven in this celebratory episode. Unsurprisingly, the Lola Aston Martin is quickest and the DB5 is slowest. The biggest surprise for me, however, is the DBR9. It was only 1.1 seconds slower than the LMP1 car and the same amount of time quicker than the 2018 GTE car. Now it makes sense that the Lola and DBR9 would be similar as they use the same engine, but the fact that the DBR9 is quicker than any of its successors in the GTE class proves just how impressive the GT1 cars of the early 2000s were. Now RSS has released a GT1 pack which includes cars from other manufacturers of that same time period, and I've bought that, so I'm going to be driving those up the hill in a future episode to make a comparison with the Aston Martin DBR9. Now I hope you've enjoyed this look back at Aston Martin's history, and I've certainly had fun researching them a bit more and reading some of the stories about their past. And I love Aston Martin as a brand, and one of my goals in life is to get involved with them in some way and hopefully own an Aston Martin somewhere along the line. Now they've had a rough year financially, but hopefully with the release of their exciting projects, the Valkyrie and the Valhalla, we will see them rise up once again. Now I look forward to seeing them on the racetrack this year at various GT events and the DTM event at Brands Hatch in the summer. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.